I was born in Hopewell, Virginia. Should have been born here, but my mother, I think, and father lived here. But my grandparents lived in Hopewell, and they were visiting, and I think I was a little earlier than I was supposed to be. So I think I spent my first 2 weeks in a dresser drawer instead of a bed because until they could travel back here. And we lived in the city of Lynchburg on Miller Street, actually, in over by Guggenhammer Hospital, if you know where that's, used to be called Guggenhammer Hospital on Great Street, up until about 6. And at that time we moved out to on what's now Florida Avenue. At the time we moved out there, it was called Jacksontown Road. My grandfather had built the house, and it's still called the Scott Home Place. It's a big white house. It's still there. It's in total disarray now, but we kind of moved around into houses that my grandfather, he owned lots of houses in Lynchburg at the time. He had a couple of meat markets here also, but up until he sold out of everything here and went back to Hopewell. So that was most of my, years were there. We stayed there until we moved I must have been about 12, maybe 10 or 12. We moved to Ridge Street in Fairview Heights. And I went to school at Mountain View School. It's not there anymore. There's a rec center for aged people there now. But I went to grade school there, and that was it for me. I quit school at 15 and went to work. I had to. My father, like I say, father was a disabled veteran of World War I. He got gassed with mustard gas in France. And at that time, there was no treatment. Nobody even knew anything about it because it's the first time, used. So they kind of kept him on morphine for about 2 or 3 years, and he was in and out of VA hospitals for the rest of his life, really. He would go in, and they would get him off, and then he'd have to go back again later on. So he and I didn't get to do the things that most young boys and fathers do. Wasn't it? He's a wonderful person, but it just everything was taken up with Daddy needs his medicine. That was what we, as young people, considered. Any money that came in, it was for Daddy's medicine. But he was a nice guy, and I had a good, I played with everybody, and we did real well. It wasn't the most, exciting thing. I mean, Christmas was a pocket knife or something like that. We never had big Christmases because nobody ever had the money to have them. And I think he was, when growing up, I think he got about $100 a month, 5 children, and the 2 adults, and the government paid him about $100 a month pension, and that don't go far. But every first of every month we would, stock up on canned goods and things like that, try to last that through. So all in all, it wasn't ideal, but still I had a nice. It was okay. Played with everybody, the kids around us. Everybody liked us, and they liked him. And he was well known in Lynchburg. My father was a singer. He would have been, you would have heard of him if he hadn't had the asthma so bad that he couldn't breathe. He sang at the Paramount Theater, and he sang in churches, and he always had his own program on WLVA in the late 30s called a shut-in program, and a minister from the First Methodist Church down in Lynchburg. The two of them. They would preach, and then people would call in and ask for songs. You know, my father would sing. So he did all right, and then it got to where he just couldn't get, you know, enough breath. So I stayed here in Lynchburg. On the wintertime, we lived in Lynchburg. In the summer, they sent me to May. My two sisters, three sisters, would go to Hopewell and stay with my grandmother. And we would stay there all summer and then come back here. So we were between the two up until I went in the Army at 17. I was 16 in 46, and it took me a month to talk them into signing the paper to let me go. And so at 17 years and 1 month, that's when I went in. I went into service at that time. I had 4 sisters, 2 older, 2 younger. And then I was in the middle. I was right in the middle. And my oldest sister went to Hopewell to go to school. She didn't want to go to school here in Lynchburg, so she went. Didn't know her that much then. She's still alive. She's the only one still alive. Her and her and myself. She's in Florida right now. And then I had Janice was the second one, and then there was me, and I had a sister named Peggy and one Gloria. And Gloria and Peggy both died, so the only one left is Alna and I, as far as the family. And we all lived together in a 2-bedroom house, and it was kind of crowded, because the girls all slept in one room, and the other we had a back bedroom, had 2 big beds in it. My mother and father slept in one, and I slept in the other one. So we were right crowded in there, but we didn't have water, we didn't have toilets, we didn't have, in fact, we didn't have electricity until I went in. In fact, I think I got electricity after I left, went to service in 1946. But we had the outhouse down, a few yards behind the house. When I quit school at 15, I went to work for Virginia Laundry. It was down on 12th Street. I think I made $12 a week. And I gave my mother 10, and I had 2, And then I worked there a year, and the second year, when I was 16, I went to work for Reynolds Drugstore. They had a drugstore on Main Street called Reynolds. I went to work for him, and I worked there until I was 17. All I wanted to do was get in the Army, I wanted to do that from the time it started, So as soon as they signed it, I went, and it was quite an experience. My mother, she cried and carried on, and my father, he didn't mind that much. He one way or the other, but my mother did, and I went from Lynchburg to Fort Meade, Maryland, with the same people that I joined with. So there was some friends that I knew here, but I had joined the engineers, and the rest of them had just, joined the Army. They were assigned whatever they wanted to, but I specifically stated, I wanted to go to engineers. So we got to Fort Meade, and we took all our shots and did all that stuff, and the next day after we got finished processing, they shipped everybody out, and the only one that went to the engineers was me. At the time that you sign up, you can pick your branch of the service that you wanted to go in. There's ordnance, engineers, maintenance, quartermaster, and all of those is all different branches. If you specifically want to join one, in other words, if you like electronics, you could join the Signal Corps, and then the Signal Corps trains at a different place from what other places, like Fort Hood is artillery, And at the time, Fort Belvoir was and still is the engineer center for the Army. So when I was sent to Fort Belvoir for my basic training and everything, and then like I say, since I was the only one that joined for the engineers, I was the only one on the train going to Fort Belvoir. I was by myself, nobody there. And the Army, being the Army, they gave me a ticket to get on the train and a phone number to call when I got to where, I was going. And I called, and took them 2 or 3 hours to come get me. I stay in a little place called Accotink, Virginia. At that time, it was just a spot in the road. I don't know what it is now. Of course, that was in 1946, so it's different. But they finally came pick me up and took me to the barracks, and I went in this real long barracks, where there's maybe 60 or 70 people in. There was one other man in there at the time because they were just starting a new class of basic training. And I got in there and I looked around, and I thought to myself, what in the hell am I doing here, all alone? And I got real homesick, so I went to the Red Cross Club, wasn't too far away, the service club. And I went down there and called my home. And my mother answered the phone. And I started crying. And I bet I cried for 10 minutes. I couldn't stop bawling, I just kept, and I kept telling Mama, I want to come home, and I could hear her screaming at my father, I told you, Bob, I told you not. But anyway, my father came on the phone, and he told me, he said, son, you're just homesick. He said, I want you to do something. He said, go back to the barracks where you were, and go to the guy that's in there. I said, if you saw a man, tell him your name is John, and ask him his name, ask him where he's from, tell him where you're from, and he said, you'll be okay. And I stayed in the Army for 20 years. I never got homesick again. Never, except when I was away from, her once in a while. I'd go on maneuvers or something for 2 or 3 weeks, and you get home. But I mean, it never bothered me after that. And that was all it took. I just went in, told the guy who I was, him who he was, and everything went along. And I took basic there at Fort Belvoir, and finished basic, and went in. Might be jumping a little ahead, but I think that they were. Of course, this was in September of '46, so I think this Trieste. This little function in the had what they called the Morgan Line after World War II, and that was a line that kind of divided, the communist Yugoslavia from Italy, that part of Italy, and Trieste at the time was one of the best deep water ports on the Mediterranean, at that area, and I think they were because they kind of rushed us through basic training. And right into school, and I went to carpenter school. As soon as I finished basic training, we went right straight to carpenter school, and the next thing I ended up at Fort in New Jersey, Fort Dix, New Jersey, and they're in boat and on their way. I think they were trying to get more people into that area because everybody over there at the time was coming home. All of the soldiers, the war was over in 45, and they were shipping everybody home. So they needed people to refill. And we went into a town called Cividale. Was a little small town in Venezia Giulia, which included Trieste, Udine, Padre Ciano, a whole bunch of things. But the area was called Venezia Giulia, and the Morgan Line ran up through there, and that's where we were for the first. I got there in '46, and we built tents and everything for everybody. Then we moved up to the Morgan Line, and we were stationed along the Morgan Line until later in 1947 when they finally, the UN and everybody got together and they settled the thing, and they made Venezia Giulia into 2 sections, Section A and B, A was the American section, which included the city of Trieste and the dock and the area, the dock area, and B was all of the little smaller villages and things next to Yugoslavia. That went to Yugoslavia, so they kind of divided it into, and that's where they got, you know, the Americans. And they sent the when it was over with, what they ended up with was 5,000. There would be 5,000 American troops, 5,000 British, and 5,000 civilian police in Trieste itself on our side. Yugoslavians, you had nobody had any idea what they had, but that was for Zone A. The British wanted part of it too, so they came, and we had the city was more or less. We had 2 battalions up on Opacina, where Yolanda's from, and we had 1 battalion down in the city itself. So we had 3 battalions of infantry, and then we had the support groups, which was quartermaster engineers, and that's where I was. And that's the place that I was. It was at what used to be a school, I think, at one time, and that's where I ended up. And that's, you know, where I met her. But Trieste itself was until 54. I think 54, everybody moved out of there. Just because I wanted to be a soldier. That was because there's no other reason. I mean, you know, and I just wanted to be. I wanted to be a soldier, and that was my life's, you know, dream right at that time when I was 15 years old. And then the war had started, and of course, Lynchburg used to be every Friday night. Almost all of the soldiers that were stationed down at Camp Pickett, you know, used to come here for the weekend. But, and I was always around soldiers. You know, they was always here from 1940 on. It was always here. And I don't know that I ever. I can't really ever think of wanting to be anything else except, you know, in the military. That's just what I wanted to do. I don't know why would anybody want anything. To me, it was just, you know, the Germans had done so many atrocities and so many bad things. I wanted to get over there and, you know, make them pay. That was and of course, by the time I got there, I tried to get in so many times, and they always caught me, you know, because of the age thing. And they wouldn't sign, and I would go down and try to join, and, you know, they'd look at me and say, "Kid, you know, how old are you?" You know, and I said, 17. And then they asked me stupid questions like, "When were you born?" And by the time I sputtered out, it's always wrong, you know. But it's just one of those things, like some people, you know. An example is Stephanie. I can't remember Stephanie ever wanting to be anything except a veterinarian. Brandon can tell you, when she's little things, she wanted to be a veterinarian. I wanted to be a soldier. She's a veterinarian, you know, and I ended up a soldier and spent 20 years being one, you know. With my parents, you know, with my father, none. My father never, I can't ever remember my father slapping, hitting, or doing anything to anybody. Sweetest man you ever met. But he had the problem, there's no question about that. My mother was a little rough on us, especially me. I think I'm the only boy. She couldn't hit my dad, so when she got mad enough, she'd take it out on me. I was never in trouble. Honestly, I used to get caught swimming naked in the swimming pool with all the little black kids that lived down at the end of Miller Street. You know, we had a pool down there, and we'd all go down there, And my mother would come looking for me, and she could always hear my voice because I would holler, and I wasn't, just a young, and we would all be swimming and carrying on. And at that time, you didn't do that. In 1930s, you just that one, you didn't associate that close to blacks, So that, but and I used to. We lived so far away from town. If I went to town, I had to walk. And I tell Yolanda, them right now, the only time in my life that I ever did anything that was wrong is I stole a yo-yo, 10-cent yo-yo. And I was so scared that for 3 days, every time I saw a policeman, I ran like hell. I thought, sure, they know that I stole this yo-yo. But I had 10 cents. I'd cleaned the lady's chicken coop, and she gave me a dime. And I walked 3 miles downtown to the 10-cent store, which was on Main Street, and went up to the counter. Of course, I was about this tall, and my nose just about reached the top, and picked up the yo-yo and had the dime to give the lady. She kept talking to people, and she never turned around. And I waited and waited, and she didn't turn around, so I started stepping back, step here, step there. And I kept going until I got right by the door, and then I took off. And like I say, for 3 days, I was scared the police were going to come after me. And in my whole life, and 20 years in the Army and everywhere, I've never stolen anything. That was it. That one yo-yo, So I wasn't a bad person. We were just poor. That's all. And you got along. I never owned a suit of clothes until the Army gave me a uniform. We just didn't have it. And so you made up with what you made up with what you had, things were so different. We would leave in the summertime when school's out. We would get up in the morning, and if there was anything to eat, usually, Mama always had biscuits, and you'd leave, and sometimes we'd stay gone all day, and we'd come home at 4 or 5 o'clock at night. We'd just be gone. We'd go play, fly kites. I lived over on, like I say, Jacksontown Road and all, and we'd walk all the way over here to Lynchburg College and just have a good time. The neighbors, the boys that I grew up with. We had 2 or 3 creeks around, and we had swimming holes in every one of them that we built ourselves. So. It was just a matter of sitting around and feel sorry for yourself or just have a good time. And we just had a good time. I just, went. I'm sorry about the thing that and I'm most worried about was the education part of it. But I couldn't go to school. Daddy, would take me out of school to go with him to get it. What we called his medicine, and we would go from drugstore to drugstore you could only, at the time he was taking, you could only get 1 bottle a day from each drugstore. So I would go and he would go, and the 2 of us, would go up and down Main Street to get what he needed, and he didn't really care whether I went to school or not. My mother did, but he never did. But that didn't make him a bad person or anything. It just made him a person that, he just about gave his life, for the country. And so I respected him for that. But he was never, he ended up, he died at here, but he spent a lot of time in Pennsylvania, VA hospitals all over Pennsylvania. He would come home, he'd stay home 3 or 4 months, and he'd get back on medication, and they would send him back, and he'd stay maybe for 6 months, and he'd come back. And sometimes he'd stay clean for almost a year, then he'd end up, going back again. Not his fault at all. It was just one of those things that that happened back in 1917, 18. And if like I say, if his life had been just a little bit different, the voice that he had was absolutely fantastic. He had the best tenor, and he won every time. He used to tell me that we would go, they would have a singing contest, you know. And there was one other guy here in Lynchburg at the time, I can't think of his name, it's too small at the time, but Daddy's as a tenor. And he'd always tell me, he said, now son, you listen, he said, he's gonna sing Old Man River. He said, that's a baritone song. And that's the only thing he knows how to sing. And he was right. The guy would always, every time they had a singing contest, he would always sing the same song, you know, Old Man River, because it was for a baritone. But he did have he had a beautiful, beautiful tenor voice, you know. The last time I remember was my birthday, and I think I was 6, and he was on the air, and we, you know, he told me before he went, said, listen, you know, make sure to listen, and he wished me a happy birthday, and that was in, I think either 35, 36, and that was it. Then he couldn't sing anymore. He tried, you know, but he sang in the choir at the church until he got to where his breathing just wasn't. One day he couldn't hold the high notes, you know. When I left Fort Belvoir, like I said, we went to school, took basic training, went to school. They shipped us in in September of '46. We landed, of course, in Leghorn. Livorno is in Italian, but it's Leghorn. And from there, I was sent up to an engineer battalion in the little town Cividale. And I'm getting in the wrong place. But I was sent up to this little town, and I went into the city commander, and they asked me, you know, what do you do? And I told them I'm 050, that's the carpenter's MOS, the Army thing. I said, I'm a carpenter, you know, and he looked at me and said, I don't need no carpenters. He said, you go down to the motor pool. He said, they got a job for you. And remember, I was 17 years old. I weighed, soaking wet, I probably weighed 30 pounds. So they sent me down to the motor pool, and at the time they were digging a ditch from the camp up to a little stream that was up there to run water down. And knowing Italy, and especially around Trieste, it's all lava, you know, it was all volcanic at one time. And seeing I was the youngest, not only the youngest, but you know, the smallest one there, they put me working a jackhammer. And if you ever run an Army jackhammer in 1946, it's a 2.5 ton truck with this big air compressor on the back of it. The jackhammer by itself, with nothing on it, weighs 90 pounds. Now, I didn't weigh but 120 something. And 8 hours a day I was up with that damn thing digging in rocks, you know. I'd get off and go home and try to go to sleep, and I couldn't. I'd shake all night, you know. And simply because I was the youngest one, you know, it was always me that run the damn jackhammer. And I did that for a while, and they called us all together one day and said they wanted everybody with a U.S. Serial number to fall off in one area and RA in another. RA is regular Army, US was United States Army. That was draftees and people that didn't, regular Army, we joined ourselves. And they just wanted us separated. So they separated us and took everybody with an RA and put them all in one company. And the next morning they'd load us up on a truck, and off we went. And we didn't have any idea where we were going. From there, we went to a little place called Sistiana, which is right on the beach. And this is in January, I think, February. It was so damn cold, and the wind just blowing in off the water, you know, there. And we were engineers, so they sent us up there to set up tents for the infantry because they were going to bring infantry in. So I went there, we stayed there for a couple of months and built tents, 4-man tents. Once we got the tents built, then again, they loaded us up on trucks and took off. And that's when I got to Opicina, which is Trieste. and that's when I first went into Opachina. It was still bombed out. You know, the buildings were still down. It hadn't been rebuilt at all. In fact, the house where she lived was still bombed up. But we went to the little barracks, and we stayed there. And they had a tank company and an infantry company up above us, and then one other place they had another battalion of thing. We were the only engineers around, and we started, you know, working, and we rebuilt the building because there were no windows, there was no gas, no lights, no heat, no anything. This building, actually the British had been living in there before we did, and they ain't very good soldiers. I hope you're not British, but they're not. I mean, one thing Americans are, and that sharp, they're soldiers, you know. And this place was just a total wreck. And I think we were there for a while, and one day this door opened, and some big, tall guy walked in the door, you know, and everybody turned around and looked at him, because there was no discipline at the time, because everybody was waiting to go home. Most of the NCOs, the officers, and this guy came walking through the door, and he walked up to. Nobody said anything, so he walked up to a sergeant that was standing in line waiting to go eat, and said, "You know, go with me." And he went outside, and he talked to him for a minute, and he came back in the door. And when he walked through the door, this guy hollered attention as loud as he could. And that was the day that we really started being, you know, soldiers. And the last time I saw him, I think Brandon was with us. He was a major general, and I looked for him everywhere I went in the Army. I always looked for this guy, because he was everything that I wanted to be. Army, that was him. I mean, you know, he put in things. You walk down the hallway. If he was walking towards you, when he got right in front of you, you stopped dead still and stood at attention and backed against the wall until he passed you, you know. And it wasn't something that people, we didn't mind it, to tell you the truth, you know. And he put in so many, everything he did in West Point, he had us doing. And we had to memorize everything in the chain of command. The chain of command can start with your company commander. You know, you go from your company commander, and then your battalion commander, the division commanders, all the way up, Secretary of the Army, Secretary of Defense, to the President. And you had to know the name of every one of them, and you had to be able to tell them in a minute. He'd walk in front of you and said, you know, stand right nose to nose, you know, give me the chain of command. And damned if you forgot one. If you forgot one, you stayed in that night. You didn't go out, you know. But he kind of, to me, he just was the Army. That's exactly what I was looking for. And so I looked for him all the time. Couldn't find him.